and it's that glorious time again when we are doing the last lecture of a unit. In this case, it's lecture 3 of unit 7. And in this lecture, now that we've seen how energy flows through an ecosystem and how some important elements, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, flow through an ecosystem, we see that ecosystems do not stay the same throughout all time. And we're going to look at how ecosystems change as time goes on. We call this process of ecosystems changing ecological succession. All right, and one ecosystem kind of changes form to a new ecosystem as time goes on. All right, it's a gradual process. It takes time. And what happens is we see a replacement of the types of species inside an ecosystem or inside that ecosystem's community. Remember, in communities, we're looking at the interaction of only the biotic factors, the interaction of the living things. Right? We're not saying that the rocks and the water and the air are and the temperatures changing by much. We're looking more at the types of species that are changing. And every time a new community arises, each new community that arises makes it harder for the previous community to survive. So we start seeing the same process happen over and over and over again, which is why it's called succession. One community comes up and replaces the older community, like a young prince eventually grows up and replaces his father king, and we call that a succession as well. We're going to start by looking at primary succession, and primary succession is kind of rare because there's a lot of places on Earth where there's already communities, already ecosystems, and primary succession happens where no ecosystem has existed yet. All right, it begins in an area that had no life on it to begin with, or no communities on it. Right? We see these new islands created by volcanoes, or an earthquake happens and we open up a new land area that wasn't there before. We have new ground exposed as a glacier starts to move back. All right? Any surface that has not previously supported life. It is slower than the other types of succession that we're going to talk about. And the main reason it's slower because there is no soil. All right, and you need the soil for the plants to start to grow. And we'll talk a little bit more as we keep going on. At first about primary succession, then we're going to focus the majority of this lecture on secondary succession. In the primary succession, it all starts with something called a pioneer species. That's a species that first comes to the uninhabited area and colonizes it, or starts a community there, starts a population there. Right? It starts the ecological cycle. It starts the ecosystem. All right. Eventually, the pioneer species makes the new area livable, habitable for other species. Most of the time, especially if we're dealing with bare rock that has like come up out of the water from an underwater volcano, we start to see bacteria and lichens, which are little tiny plants. And the big thing is, the reason we see bacteria lichens, they have no soil. And the interaction of these lichens with the rocks lead us to form some soil. And after soil gets formed, then your more traditional plants can start taking over. But you need soil first. Now, after primary succession has occurred, or any place else that undergoes succession, is known as secondary succession. All right, so after you have those bacteria and lichens, well, now you have an ecosystem there. So as that changes, it's no longer primary succession. There's already life there. Now we're looking at replacing existing life. So this is the process where one community replaces another. And it replaces one that has either been partially or totally destroyed. And we can see secondary succession in a wide variety of ecosystems. They can be ecosystems that were disrupted, disturbed, destroyed by either humans, animals, storms, floods, earthquakes, other natural processes, any of this can lead to secondary succession. The big thing is there had to be life, or there had to be a community or an ecosystem there previously. Surface had to previously have an ecosystem on it. Eventually, as succession goes on, as communities replace other communities, we finally reach a stable community that ends up in equilibrium with the environment. And these are the big areas that we'll talk about in the next unit called biomes. And we separate the biomes based on not only some abiotic factors like climate and temperature and rainfall, we also separate them by biotic factors by the communities that live there, and usually the plant communities that live there. And these are all the stable communities that are at equilibrium with the environment, and it's called a climax community. It is the peak. It is the best possible situation for that area. All right, a climax community might change in a small way, but for the most part, it remains the same through time unless it gets disturbed by some force of nature or human or animal impact. One such type of secondary succession that humans have played a big role in over time is something called old field succession, and they busted out the creativity book when they named this one because it's what happens when farmland is abandoned, or when you have a field that is old and undergoes succession. So an old field undergoing succession is called old field succession. And so when a farmer stops cultivating his land, cultivating the field, growing his crops, first thing we start seeing are grasses and weeds pop up. And it will cover the abandoned area, and you'll see a bunch of grasses and a bunch of weeds, and it will be this mishmash of grasses and weeds. As time goes on, taller plants, such as perennial grasses, grasses that keep the same type of grass shows up every year, shrubs, and eventually trees will take over the area until you end up with probably some kind of forest there that is the same as what the natural habitat would have been there without any human disruption before the farmer started planting stuff. And that would be the climax community, would be the forest after the trees take over. And this can take hundreds of years or more. All right, here is an example of secondary succession. This kind of looks like could be old field succession. It's just one example of secondary succession. I mean, you could go to a rainforest, chop down, slash, and burn a whole bunch of the area, and then just walk away, and you'll start to see the same or similar things happening. So in the first year, you get annual plants that just live that 1 year. Second year, we start to see perennial plants and grasses that will return year after year. Right after that, shrubs start to come in until you get a veritable shrubbery of shrubs taking over the land. Then the pines start to move in. If it's in an area like ours, you'll get a young pine forest. And the pines eventually give way to oak trees. All right, big, broad, tall deciduous trees. And that could be after 150 years or more. And then we would have a mature oak forest that we might then cut down for the paper and the lumber. So all of this kind of just happens step after step after step after step after step, and this is succession. You got the community changing, right? Because the organisms that are going to thrive in a mainly grass and plant environment are vastly different from the organisms that will thrive in a mature oak forest. So even the animals that you would find there could change over time. And eventually the entire community changes, and that is succession. That is secondary succession, because there was already life here. The final thing I'm going to say about secondary succession has to do with fire and secondary succession. All right, every summer we hear about the wildfires out in the West Coast, Southern California, usually. And sometimes, and normally, there've always been fires there, all right? Natural fires usually caused by lightning, and they're necessary for the secondary succession. What they do is they will remove driftwood and brush from the community. However, if we try to stop these little fires or they get out of control, we might get major fires that can burn out of control. And that happens if too much brush or dead wood kind of just builds up over time. All right. Some animal species also depend on these fires to kind of bring out the younger versions of vegetation, the young successor, the grasses and flowers and shrubs, because they feed off of those. All right. Because after a fire has cleared the land, you're kind of starting over almost like in an abandoned field situation. The land is clear, you get grasses and flowers and shrubs move in, and then finally trees, and you get forests. And like I said, some organisms survive better in the grassland shrub area than they would ecosystem habitat, than they would in a forest ecosystem or a foresty habitat. And so you see the different animals live in different places at different times. And that is it for Unit 7 and for this lecture. So if you have any questions, again, bring them on in. If you want to look more up on this stuff or read more, this is Chapter 5 in your digital textbook. And have a good night and study hard for the upcoming test.